Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's spend a few minutes chatting about the happiness hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom by Jonathan Haidt, which is a book that I recently finished reading. And as usual, following this chat, I will touch base briefly if I have time on what I am currently reading. But for now, let's spend some time with the happiness hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. This book was originally published back in 2006, from what I can tell. I read this paperback edition, which also was published in 2006, from what I could tell from the publication history. So this is a work of nonfiction. Jonathan Haidt, I believe, is a social psychologist, and so this book really takes apart each chapter. Pertains to some sort of aspect of ancient wisdom, and then the author explores sort of the science around that, the social science about, from today's perspective, around those topics. So I thought I would just read a brief description that's in the preface, and that sort of tells what the book is about. It says, "This is a book about 10 great ideas. Each chapter is an attempt to savor one idea that has been discovered by several of the world's civilizations, to question it in light of what we know from scientific research, and to extract from it the lessons that still apply to our modern lives." So yeah, each of the chapters, I thought I would go chapter by chapter. Each of the chapters actually starts out with a couple of quotes from really non-scientific sources of, wisdom. And so then explores those two, really explores that idea that's found in this sort of non-scientific quotes from the world's past, thinkers of the past. So let's just jump into it, because there's 10 of them. The first one, chapter 1, is called The Divided Self, and the quotes are, "For what the flesh desires is opposed to the spirit, and what the spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want." That's from St. Paul's to the Galatians. That's from the Christian New Testament in the Bible. And then the second quote for this chapter is, "If passion drives, let reason hold the reins." So what this chapter really explores is, sort of our duality, how we have this sort of unconscious mind and then sort of this, sort of rational mind. And he uses this analogy of riding on an elephant. A person riding on the elephant, the elephant sort of does its own thing, and you can try to change the elephant's mind about where you're going, but you're actually riding on the elephant, and the elephant, the driver, is your conscious self, and then the elephant is really all the other forces within you that is taking you through life. So that's sort of the idea that he explores in this chapter. The second one's called Changing Your Mind, and the quotes are, "The whole universe is change, and life itself is what you deem it," by Marcus Aurelius. And then the second quote is, "What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind," and that is from Buddha. So this is all about how we make our own reality, largely, right? How we construct a narrative of our life and then follow that. Chapter 3 is called Reciprocity with a Vengeance. And then the quotes are, "Zhidong asked, 'Is there any single word that could guide one's entire life?' The master said, 'Should it not be reciprocity? What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others.'" That's from the Analects of Confucius. And then the second quote is, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This, in a few words, is the entire Torah. All the rest is but an elaboration of this one central point." That's Rabbi Hillel, 1st century BC. So this chapter is all about, the golden rule, right? Do unto others, and how that's been a recurring sort of moral focus of wisdom across many cultures and for a very, very long time in human history. Chapter 4 is called The Fault of Others. The first quote is, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." That's from Matthew chapter 7, from the Christian New Testament in the Bible. And then the second quote for this chapter is, "It is easy to see the faults of others, but difficult to see one's own faults. One shows the faults of others like chaff winnowed in the wind, but one conceals one's own faults as a cunning gambler conceals his dice. That's from Buddha. That quote is from Buddha. So this chapter is all about how it's so easy to find fault with other people, but so hard to really have a sort of an insight into our own faults. And so how we sort of hide our own faults from ourselves, and the science of that and the science behind that. Number 5, chapter 5, the pursuit of happiness. Good men at all times surrender in truth all attachments. The holy spend not idle words on things of desire. When pleasure or pain comes to them, the wise feel above pleasure and pain. That's from the Buddha. And then, do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. That's from Epictetus, and so, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. And I think it's really interesting how Stoicism, ancient Greek Stoicism and Roman Stoicism, intersects with a lot of Buddhist thought. But this pursuit of happiness is all about really controlling one's desire for outside things, external things, and do external things bring us pleasure? What is the science behind that? Then chapter 6, love and attachments. No one can live happily who has regard to himself alone and transforms everything into a question of his own utility. You must live for your neighbor if you would live for yourself. And that's from Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. No man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. That's by John Donne. So this is love and attachments. This is the importance psychologically to us, the science behind how we form attachments and how much we need them in order to feel connected, and not only to feel connected, but to actually be healthy and happy. Chapter 7, the uses of adversity. When heaven is about to confer a great responsibility on any man, it will exercise his mind with suffering, subject his sinews and bones to hard work, expose his body to hunger, put him to poverty, place obstacles in the paths of his deeds, so as to stimulate his mind, harden his nature, and improve wherever he is incompetent. That's by Meng Zhu in China, 3rd century BC China. And then the second quote for this chapter is, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," and that's by Nietzsche. So this chapter is all about the uses of adversity and how overcoming challenges is a part of the human condition, and we actually need obstacles and challenges put in front of us in order to grow as people. And so this chapter explores that topic. And then chapter 8, the Felicity of Virtue. It is impossible to live the pleasant life without also living sensibly, nobly, and justly. And it is impossible to live sensibly, nobly, and justly without living pleasantly. So that's by Epicurus. It's impossible to live the pleasant life without living sensibly and nobly and justly, and it's impossible to live sensibly, nobly, and justly without living pleasantly. I love that. And then the second quote for this chapter is, "Set your heart on doing good. Do it over and over again, and you will be filled with joy. A fool is happy until his mischief turns against him, and a good man may suffer until his goodness flowers." And this chapter explores about how doing good actually benefits us psychologically, and striving for that excellence of virtue also, brings a sort of happiness. If you feel like you're doing good, most people, if they feel like they're doing good, feel fulfilled. All right, chapter 9, Divinity with or without God. We must not allow the ignoble to injure the noble, or the smaller to injure the greater. Those who nourish the smaller parts will become small men. Those who nourish the greater parts will become great men. That's by Meng Zhu from 3rd century China. 3rd century BC China. Second quote, God created the angels from intellect without sensuality, the beasts from sensuality without intellect, and humanity from both intellect and sensuality. So when a person's intellect overcomes his sensuality, he is better than the angels. But when his sensuality overcomes his intellect, he is worse than the beasts. So this is about finding divinity. That's by Muhammad, by the way. So that quote's from Muhammad. This chapter is about divinity with or without God. So divinity, how humans sort of need a divine or feel connected to a divine, and that's not always related to a deity. There's all sorts of divine, and the connection to the divine is not always through some sort of supernatural being, and this chapter explores that concept. And then chapter 10 is called Happiness Comes from Between, and the quotes for this chapter are, who sees all beings in his own self, and his own self in all beings, loses all fear. When a sage sees this great unity and his self has become all things, what delusion and what sorrow can ever be near him? That's from the Upanishads. And the second quote is, I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel like that when we die and become a part of something entire, whether it is sun and air or goodness and knowledge. At any rate, that is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. So this is about happiness. This chapter is about happiness, and what it is, and how to find that sort of happiness in sort of the balance of, it actually talks about the next chapter in the balance, how happiness comes from, there's a happiness formula, which I will read here in a bit. That the conclusion, on balance, all things come into being by conflict of opposites, Heraclitus, 500 BC, and without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. That's William Blake. This is talking about balance. So we can't be happy all the time and still grow as people, I think is what they're trying to say here in the last two chapters, that we need some level of adversity. And adversity can make us happy. Work can make us happy. Difficulties can make us happy. So I think that's really interesting, and I like the way that this book was structured. So a couple of thoughts about the books. One idea was the sacredness. I really liked that chapter on the divinity that I talked about, and divine spaces, and how divine spaces, I mentioned, with and without a deity, there's all sorts of divine spaces. There's an individual divine space that you have that might be some location or something that's something that's really meaningful to you as an individual, but you don't share that with others. And then there's spaces that are shared with lots of people, divine spaces. And, I live here in Washington, D.C., and so what I thought about was the mall down by the Capitol. There are a lot of divine spaces down there, sacred spaces down on the mall of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. of the U.S., because there's a lot of monuments, to our national myth, our national story. And so those are treated sort of reverentially. Those are sort of sacred spaces, right, for us as a country. And so there's this individual sacred space, and then all the way up to not just countries, but whole regions of people like Christianity, Muslim, big religions that are multinational. All right, so I thought that was cool. And then before I run out of time, I just want to touch base on this happiness formula. And the formula is from chapter 5 of the book here. It's H equals S plus C plus V. H is happiness, equals set point, that's your biology, plus conditions, that's your environment, plus voluntary activities, meaning that's what you do, that's what you purposefully do, what you mindfully do to bring happiness to yourself. So I think that's really super cool. Happiness equals set point, plus conditions, plus voluntary activities. And then another cool thing in the book, before I completely run out of time, is this idea of what is the purpose of life versus purpose within life. So one of the chapters actually talks about this. That big question of what's the meaning of life is, instead of that question, reframing it to what is something meaningful about life, and asking that question, what is something meaningful about life, I think is what's really important and what really has caused me to think through reading this book. So I will stop the chat with that. I am completely almost out of time. I do want to touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading. I am behind a book chat. I have finished Charles Frazier's Varina, which is a historical fiction set during the Civil War era. I will get a chat up on that soon, but for now I'm reading Creating Minds by Howard Gardner. This is a look at 7 really creative people of the early 20th century. We have Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Stravinsky, Eliot, Martha Graham, the choreographer, and Gandhi. So I am just about 10% into this book. I'm not very far into it, but I will have a chat coming up on it when I am finished. Until next time, take care. Bye.